is a grounded shift in perception that frees you from fear-based behavior. Because here is something most people misunderstand. Avoidant individuals do not disconnect because they feel nothing. They disconnect because they feel too much, too fast, without the emotional tools to stay present in it. So they retreat, they go silent, they create distance. Not always because they are done with you, but because they are trying to find themselves again inside the intensity they don't know how to hold. And when you understand this, something inside you changes. You stop chasing shadows. You stop trying to force presence. You stop negotiating your worth through attention. And instead, you begin to stand still in your own energy. Because assuming they will come back is not about them. It is about you. It is about refusing to abandon yourself in the middle of uncertainty. It is about saying, I will not collapse just because someone else is confused. Now listen closely, this is where wisdom enters. When you panic, when you over-explain, when you try to pull them back emotionally, you are not actually creating connection, you are creating pressure. And pressure to an avoidant system does not translate as love, it translates as danger. So they move further away, not because you are unworthy, but because their nervous system equates closeness with loss of control. And here is where the transformation happens. When you assume they will come back, you stop behaving like someone who is losing something. You start behaving like someone who is anchored in themselves. And that shift alone changes everything. Because now you are not begging for reassurance, you are embodying it. Now, you are not proving your value, you are living it. Now, you are not waiting in anxiety, you are moving in purpose. And paradoxically, this is often what brings them back. Not pursuit, not pressure, not emotional chasing, but your absence of desperation, your calmness in the unknown, your ability to remain whole while they are away. But even deeper than that, this assumption is not about controlling their return. It is about releasing your attachment to outcomes you cannot govern. Because divine emotional maturity is this: to love without gripping, to care without collapsing, and to remain aligned even when someone else is not. You begin to realize that if someone returns, it must be from clarity, not from your pursuit. And if they do not return, you are still intact, still worthy, still enough. That is the power of emotional sovereignty. So you start living differently. You stop checking your phone like it defines your worth. You stop decoding silence like it is a prophecy. You stop shrinking your life around someone else's inconsistency. Instead, you expand, you build, you grow. You become the version of yourself that does not negotiate peace for attention. And something fascinating happens in that space. Either they return and meet you at a higher level of emotional clarity, or they don't. And you realize you were never waiting for love. You were waiting for certainty inside yourself. Because real love does not require you to abandon your center. And anyone who is meant for you will eventually learn how to meet you there. So assume they will come back if they need to. But never build your life on that assumption. Build your life on something stronger, on the truth that you are already whole. And from that wholeness, you no longer chase. You no longer panic. You simply remain. And what is meant for you will always find its way back to where it belongs. When someone has avoidant tendencies, one of the most misunderstood aspects of their behavior is how they use distance. To an anxious mind, distance feels like rejection. It feels like a door closing permanently. But in reality, for an avoidant person, distance is often not a statement of finality, it is a coping mechanism. It is how they regulate emotional overwhelm when intimacy starts to feel too intense, too fast, or too consuming. In their inner world, closeness can trigger a quiet fear of losing autonomy, identity, or emotional control. So instead of communicating that fear directly, they step back, they withdraw, they go quiet. And to the person on the other side, it can feel like abandonment. But what is actually happening is far more complex. They are not necessarily deciding against you. They are trying to recalibrate themselves within the emotional experience they do not yet know how to hold. This is why their absence cannot always be interpreted as a conclusion. In many cases, it is a pause, a retreat into their internal world where they attempt to process emotions without external pressure. And because avoidant individuals often struggle with vulnerability in real time, they return to connection only after they feel internally regulated again. Understanding this does not mean excusing inconsistency or waiting endlessly for someone who cannot show up. It simply means seeing the pattern clearly. Because when you misinterpret their withdrawal as permanent rejection, you react from fear. You chase. You over-explain. You try to fix what is not yet finished in their internal process. And ironically, that reaction often increases their need for space. But when you understand that distance is not always the end of attachment, your entire emotional response changes. You stop personalizing every silence. You stop assuming every pause is a verdict on your worth. and you begin to respond with more grounded awareness instead of emotional urgency. Silence is one of the most emotionally charged experiences in relationships, especially when you're dealing with someone who is inconsistent or avoidant. In nature, the mind naturally rushes to fill silence with meaning, and more often than not, it fills it with fear. You start asking, did I do something wrong? Have they lost interest? Is this the end? But silence is not always a message of rejection. It is often a reflection of internal processing that has nothing to do with your value. For avoidant individuals, silence can be a form of emotional regulation. When feelings become too intense or too close for comfort, they may withdraw, not because they are done, but because they are overwhelmed. In those moments, they are not always capable of expressing what they feel in real time. So instead of communicating confusion, they default to distance. What looks like emotional disappearance is often internal recalibration. From the outside, this creates pain because there is no closure, no explanation, no clarity. But assuming that silence equals rejection is where most emotional suffering begins. Because you start reacting to an assumption rather than reality, you begin to pursue answers that may not even exist in the way you imagine them. This is where emotional discipline becomes essential. Silence should not automatically be interpreted as loss. Sometimes it is simply space for someone to regulate themselves, space for emotions to settle, space for clarity to emerge without external pressure. When you learn to hold silence without collapsing into fear, something powerful happens inside you. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop overextending yourself to fill gaps that are not yours to fill. And you begin to anchor your worth in something more stable than someone's immediate response. Because silence, in itself, is not proof of rejection. It is neutral until you assign meaning to it. And the meaning you choose determines whether you suffer or grow through it. When you chase, over-explain, or emotionally spiral in response to distance, you are not actually improving the connection. You are unintentionally escalating the very dynamic you are trying to fix. Hence, in relationships involving avoidant tendencies, pressure is rarely received as care. It is often experienced as emotional demand, and when someone already has a sensitivity toward feeling overwhelmed in closeness, that sense of demand can activate their instinct to pull away even further. Chasing can take many forms. It can look like repeated messages, long emotional explanations, attempts to clarify everything at once, or trying to fix the disconnect immediately. On the surface, it feels like effort, it feels like love, but energetically, it often communicates urgency and fear. And fear, when projected outward, rarely creates safety in the other person, it creates distance. Sessions for fall. An avoidant individual, emotional intensity that comes too fast or too persistently can feel like a loss of space. They may not consciously analyze it this way, but their nervous system responds to it by stepping back. So what begins as your attempt to bring closeness often results in reinforcing their withdrawal pattern. It becomes a cycle. They pull away, you chase. They retreat further. The deeper truth is that chasing is usually not about connection. It is about anxiety relief. It is the mind trying to resolve uncertainty quickly. But relationships cannot be stabilized through urgency. They stabilize through regulation, patience, and emotional containment. When you pause the chasing pattern, something important shifts. And you stop feeding the cycle. You stop adding emotional pressure into a space that is already sensitive. And you create room for clarity to emerge naturally, rather than forcing it through reaction. This does not mean suppressing your feelings or pretending not to care. It means learning to express yourself without urgency and to respect timing as much as truth, because real connection cannot survive constant emotional escalation. It requires moments of stillness where both people can breathe without feeling pursued or pressured. When you shift into the assumption that they will come back, something subtle but powerful happens in your internal state. You begin to move out of fear and into grounded confidence, not because you have control over the outcome, but because you are no longer emotionally collapsing around uncertainty. This shift is not about predicting behavior. It is about stabilizing your nervous system so that your actions are no longer driven by panic. Fear-based energy creates urgency. It makes you overthink every delay, overanalyze every silence, and overinvest in trying to secure reassurance. But when you assume return as a possibility rather than a threat, you stop treating distance as an emergency. You begin to understand that emotional cycles often have rhythms. People withdraw, process, and sometimes return when they are regulated again. This assumption changes how you show up in very practical ways. You stop sending messages from anxiety. You stop trying to force immediate clarity. You stop negotiating your worth through response time. Instead, you begin to operate from a place where your emotional center is not dependent on external validation. And here's where the deeper transformation happens. Confidence is not loud in this state. It is quiet. It is not about proving you are okay. It is about being okay regardless of what is happening externally. That quiet confidence is deeply stabilizing, not only for you, but also in how you are perceived by others, because people, especially those who are sensitive to emotional intensity, respond differently to energy that is calm, steady, and unpressured, assuming they will come back. Also protects you from emotional collapse. It prevents you from making impulsive decisions rooted in fear, such as self-abandoning, overgiving, or compromising your own boundaries just to maintain contact. Instead, you begin to hold your position. You continue your life, you invest in your growth, and in doing so, you create a version of yourself that is no longer emotionally reactive, but emotionally regulated. That is the true shift. From desperation to dignity, from uncertainty to inner stability, from chasing to standing still in your own worth. Your value in a relationship is never truly determined by someone's proximity to you, their consistency, or their ability to show up in a steady way. Yet emotionally, many people unconsciously begin to measure themselves through exactly those external factors. When someone pulls away, stops communicating, or becomes inconsistent, it can quietly trigger a question inside: what did I do wrong? And over time, if you are not careful, that question transforms into identity. Maybe I am not enough. But that is a distortion of reality. Someone else's capacity for closeness is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their emotional availability, their attachment patterns, their history, and their ability to tolerate intimacy. When you confuse their limitations with your value, you begin to abandon yourself in places where you actually need grounding. And self-respect becomes the anchor in this dynamic. Because self-respect says, I can care about you without losing myself in the process. It means you do not lower your standards just to maintain access. It means you do not shrink your needs to become easier to choose. And it means you do not interpret inconsistency as something you must earn your way out of. Emotional independence is not detachment from love. It is freedom from dependency on validation. It is the ability to remain stable even when someone else is unstable. When you develop this, their presence or absence no longer defines your emotional state. You can feel disappointment without turning it into self-rejection. You can experience distance without collapsing your sense of worth. This is where real strength emerges, not in controlling outcomes, but in refusing to let outcomes define you. Because the moment your value becomes tied to someone's behavior, you lose yourself in every fluctuation of their attention. But when your worth is anchored internally, something shifts. You begin to operate from dignity instead of desperation. You no longer chase approval as proof of value. You simply express, observe, and choose what aligns with your emotional well-being. And in that space, you realize being chosen by someone inconsistent was never the measure. Remaining true to yourself is love. Involving someone with avoidant tendencies is rarely about intensity, urgency, or emotional pursuit. It operates on a different rhythm, one that requires patience, awareness, and above all, alignment. Alignment means that both people are able to meet each other, not just in emotion, but in emotional capacity. And when that capacity is mismatched, love becomes a cycle of closeness and withdrawal rather than steady connection. For the empathic or emotionally open person, the natural instinct is often to bridge distance, to explain more, to understand more, to try harder. But with avoidant dynamics, effort alone does not create safety. In fact, too much emotional pressure can unintentionally disrupt the very connection you are trying to preserve. This is why love in this context cannot be built on pursuit. It must be built on grounded presence. Patience here is not passive waiting. It is active emotional regulation. It is the ability to remain centered when someone else is not. It is choosing not to react impulsively to every shift in behavior. Instead, it is observing patterns, respecting timing, and allowing clarity to unfold without forcing it. The becoming someone who remains whole in uncertainty is one of the most transformative emotional skills you can develop. It means your identity is not fragmented by someone else's inconsistency. It means your peace is not outsourced to their communication habits. And it means your sense of self remains intact even when connection fluctuates. In this state, love stops being a chase and starts becoming a reflection of how much emotional maturity exists on both sides. Because true connection cannot survive imbalance indefinitely. It either finds equilibrium or it reveals incompatibility. And this is where divine principle enters the picture. Not in control, but in trust. Trust that what is aligned will not require you to abandon yourself. Trust that what is meant for you will not consistently confuse your worth. And trust that your emotional stability is not something to be sacrificed for temporary connection. So love becomes less about holding on tightly and more about standing in alignment, ready, open, but never lost. In the end, the real lesson is not about whether someone stays, leaves, or returns. It is about whether you remain grounded in yourself through all of it. When you stop chasing certainty and start building emotional stability within, you no longer lose yourself in someone else's inconsistency. You learn to love without panic, to care without collapsing, and to choose without fear. If someone returns, let it be from clarity, not confusion. And if they don't, let it be proof that your life was never meant to shrink around uncertainty. Because what is true